Okay, last day of notes ever here. So we're going to start with the Supreme Court case of Obergefell v. Hodges. This Supreme Court case legalized gay marriage across the country. So originally is basically overturning the court case Baker v. Nelson from back in 1971, which said that it doesn't violate the Constitution to deny someone a marriage license. It's not necessarily a right to get married. But the way the Supreme Court interprets the 14th Amendment in this case is that it does, and that if you're going to, the 14th Amendment promises equal protection under the law for all citizens. So if you're going to promise one person a marriage license, you have to promise it for all people. So this court case came down on June 26 of 2015, and Congress shortly after passes an additional law expanding it onto Native American lands. All right, ISIS is a big player here right now, so hopefully we'll answer any questions that you might have about this group. So ISIS stands for the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. They're a jihadist militant group who practice Islamic fundamentalism. They proclaim religious, political, and military authority over Muslims worldwide. It's hard to get a true number on how many people they are currently controlling, but it's between 2.8 and 8 million, depending on their strongholds. So they enforce strict Sharia law, and they have a total of around 400,000 fighters working for them all over the world, is what we estimate. We're not 100% sure. They gained public attention when they started publishing videos of beheadings of soldiers, civilians, journalists, and aid workers. They've been guilty of destroying, cultural sites. This is really ethnic cleansing on a historic scale. They are currently a designated terrorist organization by every major country in the world, including the UN and the EU. And over 60 countries are directly or indirectly waging a war against them at the current moment. Their goal is pretty straightforward. They want to conquer the world, starting with the Middle East and their Holy Land. All religions who disagree with democracy have to die. So as far as crimes that they've committed, they've taken the responsibility for quite a few terrorist attacks here in recent years. The 2015 Paris attacks, the San Bernardino shootings, the Orlando nightclub shootings. But aside from that, they're guilty of religious persecution, the use of child soldiers, sexual violence, selling women into slavery, beheadings, mass executions, use of chemical weapons. It's almost impossible to estimate the amount of people we killed, so I can't really even give you a number on that. But their leader is this guy right here, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. All right, the Syrian civil war is a huge issue going on right now, the crisis in Syria. And so hopefully this information will help you sort of make sense of some of the current events happening. This is an ongoing multi-sided armed conflict in Syria. It begins as a rebellion against the president of Syria, this guy right here, Assad. Assad took power in 2000 after his father died, who had been the president before him. Now, Syria has a long history of, human rights violations, political and social inequality, economic inequality. They've been stifling freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, even freedom of assembly. From 1963 to 2000, gatherings of 5 or more in public were actually banned. So they've also really been criticized for imprisoning and torturing people critical of them within their own community. So this whole thing gets kicked off in 2011 by the Arab Spring protests. I've got a picture of some Arab Spring protests down here. The Arab Spring protests were protests and demonstrations across the Middle East throughout 2011 and 2012, both violent and nonviolent. They were in Libya, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, and Iraq. And these demonstrators were fighting for democracy, free elections, economic reform, human rights, regime change, freedom of religion, all sorts of things like this. And there was an Arab Spring protest in Syria in 2012. They were protesting the execution and torture of a 13-year-old boy who had written in graffiti on a wall, "The people want the collapse of the government." When he wrote that, he was arrested, like I said, tortured and executed. So in that protest of the execution of that 13-year-old boy, the Syrian government began to fire into the crowd and killed people, and that's when this erupted into a full-blown civil war. So it's not just a war at this moment now. It's really morphed into a whole other thing since this moment in 2012. Today, in 2017, it's very different, and it's got a lot more people involved since then. And I couldn't possibly tell you every group that's, currently fighting in one way or another in Syria. I'm just going to give you the highlights. So obviously first is Assad. He's desperately trying to hold on to the little bit of control he has, and his influence and will is being carried out by the Syrian armed forces. The Syrian government, Assad, he's being supported by Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah. Now, they've really been targeting the rebels more than anyone else, but in recent years he has somewhat started fighting ISIS. He's come under a lot of scrutiny recently for using chemical weapons against civilians, which is why Trump authorized those Tomahawk missile strikes on the Syrian military recently. The next group is the Free Syrian Army. These are the rebels. So the Free Syrian Army is basically designed to defend the Syrian civilians against the government and against violence from the government. They are being supported by the United States. We've sent them about $123 million worth of stuff, whether it be weapons or training, supplies, whatever. But they're also being supported by France and Great Britain. They've been fighting not only Assad, but also ISIS, which is one reason why we're supporting them. The next group, the Syrian Democratic Forces down here, these are, made up of a bunch of different ethnic groups in Syria. Syrian, while being a country, is an ethnicity. And there are a lot of people in Syria who've lived in Syria for generations and generations who are not ethnically Syrian. Under this old regime, those people had literally no rights at all. They were technically classified as foreigners, even if they were really from Syria. These are Arabs, Armenians, Assyrians, Turks, Kurds, all sorts of people. And they want Syria to become a democracy because that's the only way that they'll be represented and have a voice in their government. They've been, originally they formed to fight Assad, but they've actually spent most of their resources fighting ISIS. The next group is Salafi jihadist groups. These are all smaller terrorist organizations. They've been fighting Assad, so we haven't really been fighting them as much because they've been sort of doing us a favor by fighting Assad. But obviously eventually we're going to have to stomp them out as well. And then last but not least is ISIS right here. So ISIS is currently controlling large portions of northern Syria. While there's this civil war going on between Assad and the rebels, ISIS is trying to conquer this land as well. So that's sort of why we're seeing the Free Syrian Army and the Syrian Democratic Forces fighting ISIS also. And now recently Assad has started to fight ISIS as well. The UN has estimated that a total of almost 500,000 people have been killed so far in this war, to another 2 million wounded, and then another 13.5 million have been displaced as refugees. Okay, the 2016 election. So the Republicans will nominate Donald J. Trump, a real estate mogul out of New York City. He's the first president without any prior experience in either public service or the military. Eisenhower did not have any public service experience, but he did have military experience. Trump is also the oldest and wealthiest president we've ever had. The Democrats will nominate Hillary Rodham Clinton, former First Lady, former Senator, former UN Ambassador, and former Secretary of State. She is the first female nominee from a major party in the United States. So the drama here, really, most of it actually, there wasn't, I'm sure living through it probably felt like a lot of drama in the primaries, but it wasn't really. That was just a typical primary. The primary drama actually came at the Democratic National Convention. Hillary's only real competition was Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders. And that was quite a surprise for a lot of people. Going into the convention, she actually only had 54% of the delegate vote, which definitely still gives Bernie a fighting chance at the convention. But she had 80% of the superdelegates, which makes it impossible for him to win. So that's why we see people get so mad about superdelegates. Even if more people voted for Bernie, we've got the superdelegates swaying the vote to Hillary Clinton. In addition to that, the day before the convention started for the Democrats, WikiLeaks leaked thousands of Democratic National Committee emails showing that the head of the committee, along with all the people at the sort of top of the committee, the chair was this woman, Debbie Wasserman Schultz. They had purposefully been putting more into Hillary's campaign so that she would beat Bernie, which is very shady, violates all rules of the committee and of primary stuff. So ultimately, she has to resign, leading to all sorts of chaos at the convention. But don't worry, Hillary gave her a job 2 days later working for her campaign. During the general election campaign, the top issues were foreign policy, immigration, and terrorism. But most voters actually said their number one issue was the economy. That's what most voters were voting on. And by far and wide, Trump carried those voters. That was one thing that Hillary really struggled with. She actually spent about twice what Trump spent on her campaign, and she still didn't win. Voter turnout in 2016 was very low. Only about 52% of people capable of voting actually showed up. African Americans only made up 12% of the vote. LGBT community only made up 5% of the vote. 64% of voters were over the age of 40. So this is why we see so many people sort of whining about the problem, but not participating in the solution. So Hillary Clinton does win the popular vote by about 3 million votes, which is the 5th time that's ever happened. And the reason, though, we use this system is because if we didn't, then no state would actually matter except California, Texas, and New York. Literally every other state could just fall into complete anarchy and collapse, and there would be no reason for the government to have any say in it or care at all. So that's how we use the Electoral College as our elections process. So the reaction, obviously, people are upset, massive protests, but guess what? Doesn't matter. He's still president. Flint water crisis. So the Flint water crisis has been an ongoing problem since April of 2014, when the city of Flint, Michigan, decided to change their water source from Detroit, which gets their water from Lake Huron, to the Flint River. Now, when they change that, they're supposed to put corrosion inhibitors in the water to prevent anything in the pipes from contaminating the water. They don't. What ends up happening is that lead poisoning gets into the water and contaminates it, exposing almost 12,000 children and even more adults to lead poisoning in the city of Flint. We see people die, an outbreak of Legionnaire's disease. There will be, generations of medical issues to come from this. The scandal comes with the fact that the city actually got reports only a few months into this change. Still in 2014, they were getting reports of health problems from the water. In 2015 is when they found out that lead levels were 7 times higher than legally acceptable. But still, it takes until the beginning of 2016 for the governor to declare a state of emergency. Since then, the water has gone back to acceptable levels, but residents are still being instructed to use, or encouraged, to use bottled or filtered water until the pipes have been completely replaced. That won't be until 2020. Mass incarceration has been a huge topic here recently. The United States actually has the highest number of incarcerated people in the world, 2 million people in prisons, which is almost a quarter of the world's prison population. And over the last 40 years, this has gone up 500%. That's why it's become such a bigger issue here recently. So I'm going to give you 7 causes for mass incarceration in the United States. The first is increased sentencing laws. We give our people higher sentences than other countries. Countries like Canada, they actually put more people in prison every year than the United States. We just give out longer sentences. Laws like the 3 strikes rule and things like that. Reason number 2, economics and age. Crime rates are higher in low-income areas, leading to higher incarceration rates. If you're incarcerated at a young age, you're more likely to end up incarcerated later, thus continuing the cycle and devaluing the community you live in. Reason number 3, drug sentencing laws and the war on drugs. 1 in 10 Americans have been arrested on a drug-related charge. Drug-related charges are more than half of our prison population, but that has actually gone down since 1990, which I guess is positive. But this disproportionately impacts minorities and women and youth.